at least the past year, South Africa has seen a noticeable rise in hate speech expressed on social media. You remember Penny Sparrow being the embodiment of social media racism with her Facebook post last year. Others have since followed and have raised the debate on limitations of the right to freedom of expression to another level. The recent hate speech directed at homosexuals expressed by a visiting pastor at Grace Bible Church in Soweto did not happen on social media. However, social media became that platform for people to debate homophobia, with religion taking center stage as a point of reference. Now, to discuss this, Evan Janssen was joined in studio by the lecturer at the Department of Religious Studies here at University of Johannesburg, Professor Farid Essak.
Any texts can be read in many ways. It's a typical story of two looked out from behind prison bars. The one saw mud, the other saw stars. So you locate it, you look outside, what do you see? And for many of our religious communities, they come with predispositions. They come with predispositions, they come with what is called in philosophy pretexts. They have their own prejudices, they have their own assumptions about their gods, about their communities. And so God, for some communities, becomes a male, and God is white. And God is angry, God is vengeful, God is probably a heterosexual, and God is, I mean, we see it at other levels. I mean, so God becomes a South African mascot because we pray to God to give us victory on the rugby field tomorrow. God becomes a flag-waving South African or a flag-waving United States citizen as we're going to fight the war against another country tomorrow. So we create images in our, and so when you are homophobic, when you are sexist, this is the way you want to read your texts. And unfortunately, the problem with religious texts is you get away with it. You just say, but the Bible says, but it is clearly written in the Quran. And anybody that deals with biblical studies and with Quranic studies know that these texts are much more nuanced and multi-layered than what ordinary demagogues or simplistic preachers want to make out.
Do churches in South Africa and on the rest of the continent have a problem with homophobia?
I think it is universal, certainly in Africa, but in large other parts of the country, in large other parts of the world as well. It's not an entirely African problem. And by homophobia, we suggest that there is an automatic fear, an automatic anxiety about other people's sexual orientation, which I find fascinating. I mean, I find it fascinating that you as a person should be obsessed with what somebody else does. Quite frankly, I think the only moment when you have a legitimate interest in the sexual orientation of another person is when you have an eye on the person yourself. Then you need to figure out, is it worth making a move? Is it worth going any further with this or not? If you're a gay person and the other person is completely straight, then there's no point. So I'm not going to ask. So this curiosity, obsession with other people's sexuality, I think it is a kind of malaise, it is a kind of psychological illness, and I really think that people need to reflect upon themselves when they develop these kinds of obsessions about what other people do in their bedrooms.
Now, this malaise, unfortunately, always finds its place on social media. It kind of comes from the pulpit or from wherever, and it finds its way onto social media. This week, the Human Rights Commission will be having these kinds of hearings around these kind of bigoted discussions that find their way on social media. How do you view this kind of hearing, and what would you like the outcomes of it to be?
Well, I mean, both a number of Chapter 9 institutions like the Human Rights Commission and the Gender Equality in the past have had various hearings into different kinds of discriminations and so on. The one huge difficulty with many of these things is that the hearing itself becomes the event and there is very little follow-up. Yeah. But there is also a limit, I think, to what state institutions can do. They have the responsibility to advance the values of democracy, including in this particular case, non-racialism, work against homophobia, work against religious discrimination, and so on. So I think the fact that there is a discussion about it, the fact that people are seriously confronting rampant hate speech on social media, not the media in general, in social media, I think it is significant. I do think that a post-South African, well, you can't really speak about a post-apartheid South Africa because social media itself is a post-apartheid phenomenon. Yeah. But there has been an escalation in hate speech. The more and more black people come into the forefront, into fullness, into positions of authority, the more and more one sees that racists who thought that everything will be the same in a post... Yeah. The more and more they are coming to the fore. But there are, of course, also other forms of racism that have emerged. Two of the longest forms of racism has been homophobia and anti-Semitism. I mean, historically, in the history of humankind, or in the known history, certainly the last 3,000 years or so, these have been what we know. One of the but that doesn't mean because it's been the longest form that it's the most dominant form. The dominant form largely is still anti-black racism. Yeah. And in much of the West, unfortunately, religious bigotry against Islam in the form of Islamophobia, we have seen an escalation of Islamophobia and of black racism in our social media.
In conclusion, we see this rise of call it right-wing rhetoric, if one can call it that, around the world. We've seen Brexit, we see the rise of Donald Trump and the kind of things. We've seen the Muslim ban, as you've just pointed out, Islamophobia, homophobia, and so forth. Yeah, in South Africa, well, in that sort of context, when you say, oh, our problem is only a little bit on social media, but how do we strike a balance as a society between the right to express your religious beliefs and the right of an individual?
Look, the one problem is that scriptures, again, you can find in them what you want to, but the reality is also that scriptures overwhelmingly weigh in against same-sex expressions of same-sex sexuality. Yeah. And so preachers who use scriptures to legitimate hate speech against people, against homosexual people, they do have a much stronger case located in scriptures. Yeah. So on the one hand, there is the freedom of religious expression, and on the other hand, you're sitting with the question of hate speech. Until now, South Africans have done a very good job of balancing these rights. I do think that greater focus, greater glare must be placed on people who espouse hate speech. But I don't think that we can get to the stage. I mean, our constitution is clear. The one is violence, and the other one is the promotion of speech, which is hate speech, and the other one which leads to imminent violence. I don't think that that the condemnation of what in religious language may be called a sin. Yeah. I don't think that that should be described as hate speech. Yeah. If you say this kind of conduct is disagreeable, it is against our religion, it is sinful, people will be punished for it, that is, the state cannot touch that. But the state, when the state hears people being incited to act against people who are different, people who are black, against people who dress like this, and therefore they're inviting rape and so on. I think the state has a responsibility to intervene in those cases and to make sure that people are actually prosecuted for inciting harm against people who, for some reason or the other, don't fit the ideal of what a religious person should be.